But yeah, first of all, do you want to introduce yourself? Talk about about you and Neurotech reports, and then obviously you're in a wheelchair too. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, we can talk about that. So, I'm Jennifer French. I'm the executive director of Neurotech Network, which is a nonprofit that focuses on education and advocacy of neurotechnology devices, therapies, and treatments for people with neurological conditions. I'm also the senior editor and associate publisher for Neurotech Reports, which is the leading news and analysis for the neurotechnology industry.
And you have some experience with brain-machine interfaces, right?
Well, I have a lived experience, yeah. So I had a spinal cord injury back in 1998, and about a year and a half after that, I joined a clinical trial in Cleveland at the Cleveland FES Center, having a neuroprosthesis implanted. So as a person living with tetraplegia, I am basically paralyzed from my neck down. So I don't have motor function of anything that's below my injury point. So I do have the use of my arms. You see me using my hands, but I don't have all the intrinsic muscles, so I can't do all the fine motor tasks with the hands. And using and living with this neuroprosthesis, I mean, I've had it for nearly 20 years now. When you think about that, that's a long time. It's integrated into your life. You use it all the time. Your body starts to crave it. So having that lived experience and living that way, right, and integrating it into your life. I had an aha moment when I was actually at a Neural Interfaces conference way back when, I think it was 2000 or 2001, and we had a panel of people that were at the time really when the industry was still very young. And there was a woman with a deep brain stimulator, there was another woman with a cochlear implant, and there was another gentleman with a hand prosthesis, and then myself. And we were all talking, and it was this aha moment that, you know what? Really, we're the few. A lot of people living with these neurological conditions don't know about the technology that's available, nor how to access them. So that's kind of was the spark of the nonprofit for us to kind of focus on that. So the world has changed, obviously, since then, in a good way. So it's good that this whole industry is starting to mature, and we've watched it mature over the years. And we're seeing it where people are getting more engaged, where research is becoming more engaged. And really, we're starting this whole movement of consumer engagement into this industry. It's been really taken hold in the pharmaceutical industry, but we're still very on the early stages in the medical device and particularly in the neurotechnology space.
Yeah, I would say so too, and it's starting to reach an inflection point a little bit. But I don't know, I feel sorry about having to bring this up, but do you want to tell your story about how you got the injury? Because it's kind of epic.
Don't feel sorry for asking. We all do. I'm obviously not shy talking about it because I wrote a book about it. So my book is On My Feet Again, and it really kind of talks about my journey from injury to, becoming one of these bionic pioneers, becoming one of the first people to get these types of implants. So it was 1998, and I was working, at the time it was the .com era. So if you can imagine at that time, there was a lot of startups, there's a lot of activity. If you were in the tech business, it was really kind of vibrant, and it was a really fun place to be. And I was working for a company in southern New Hampshire, and the company went public. We brought it public, and this was my first weekend off. And so we rented a house up in one of the ski areas, and we went on a midnight run, which was kind of our tradition to do. There were about a dozen of us that slept on our skis and our snowboards and went down the mountain, and it was beautiful because it was a full moon, and the trails are glowing. So it's this awesome experience, right? So, and we had a pickup truck at the bottom of the mountain to pick us up. So 11 of us made it down. I didn't. I hit a patch of ice, went down a 40-foot embankment, kissed a bunch of trees, and suddenly came out as a tetraplegic. So at that point, your life just, it changes. I mean, everything that you did that morning, you can no longer do again. And it really is kind of this journey of getting yourself and getting your life back, because it's basically stripped away from you.
Wow, that's incredible. And then, I mean, you were doing such a like active thing, and then you didn't want to, I don't know, sit by when there were treatments available. Do you want to talk about this? Like you said, a year and a half later, you were able to do a treatment, but they didn't want to take you, right?
Right. Yeah, that's so true. So, you know, when you leave the hospital with a spinal cord injury and you're sent home, it's kind of like, that's it. There's no cure for spinal cord injury. You do what you have to do to get by, and that's it. So you're really kind of left off this cliff. Since then, you know, there's support groups and things have changed, you know, over the years, but still there's no cure for spinal cord injury, and today there still isn't. So what's next? You know, how do you keep your body healthy? I think one thing a lot of people forget is that with these conditions, it's not just the paralysis, it's all the secondary conditions that come after that can kill you. It's, you know, the bladder infections, it's the muscle atrophy, it's the osteoporosis, it's the pressure sores, it's all of these things that can really deteriorate your life, not necessarily the paralysis. So you're constantly in this fight to keep your body healthy. But I also came to this revelation of, okay, there's no cure, you know, what's next, right? So there has to be something. So I started to look into research and said, you know, if I can't sit on the sidelines and do nothing, right? I can sit in the side, or I can become an active participant and try to move science forward. So that's when I decided to look at clinical trials. And ironically, I was using an FES bike. And at the time, you know, FES bike is surface stimulation on a cycle. And it helps to keep your body healthy and your body moving. And at the time, people didn't have them in their homes. I had to drive down to Boston to be able to get it. And I was going through an appeal with my insurance company, trying to get access and more treatments so I can still go and use this piece of technology. And in writing my appeal, I found this research group in Cleveland called the Cleveland FES Center, and was trying to find some research and asked them to send me some stuff. And they said, oh, well, by the way, we've got these clinical trials going on as well. Oh, okay. Well, that sparked my interest, right? And they ended up having this implanted neuroprosthesis for lower extremities. So I made a video, you know, the old-fashioned videos.
Yeah, like a VHS.
Yeah, no, it was the little ones. But still, I made a video and I sent it off to them with a letter saying, hey, listen, I'd like to join your clinical trial. And, you know, I had to hire a personal trainer to be able to put on these long KFOs. They're these plastic braces that go up to your hip, down to your foot, so I can get up and at least try to move. So I was active and, you know, trying to make the case of why I meet the inclusion criteria for this clinical trial. And they wrote back and said, well, thank you for applying, but no. And part of their reply, they said, well, we've never implanted a woman, so we're not accepting women into the clinical trial. And of course, that sparked me and said, well, wait a minute. You know, 20% of women.
Did you hear how I got injured? Actually,
exactly. Well, yeah, and you know, I made the case back to him and said, you know, 20% of spinal cord injuries are women, and sooner or later, you've got to implant a woman because we're part of the population. And you know, rightfully so, they did their background research. They had real concerns about implanting into the abdomen in a childbearing woman, what that would do, and what kind of precautions had to be made for that. And they did that background research and got back with me, and eventually they let me into their clinical trial. Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, like, do you want to talk about the trial and everything like this, and maybe who you worked with, like maybe some previous guests on the show, and the process and everything like this, going through all these steps.
Yeah. So you know, we flew to Cleveland and went through the first stage in terms of, you know, the evaluation to see if you met it, and you had to send all of your medical records, etc. So the principal investigator in that trial is Dr. Ron Triolo from Case Western Reserve. And at the time, Hunter Peckham was the director of the FES Center. So, in meeting all of them, it seemed like a really, a viable group. And of course, I had to do my background research. I wanted to make sure that they were funded and that they were a viable research team and that they had real outcomes and there were papers that were written from them. And, doing that due diligence as a clinical trial participant is really important because I think we forget sometimes that there are scam clinical trials out there. And there's a lot of medical tourism going on that try to mask themselves as clinical trials. Hey, come on, we'll put some stem cells into your spine and we'll zap you a little bit with some electrical stimulation if you pay us $20,000 or something like that. So that really happens in the world. So as a participant, to do that background research is really important.
That seems especially evil, to take advantage of, I don't know, people who just want to get better. That's pretty low.
It's extremely low, but it happens around the world. And it's really sad that it happens, that we have to do, this kind of due diligence. Clinicaltrials.gov does a really good job of streaming out a lot of those. So it's a good resource. However, some of them still get through. So it's at a point where you really need to do a buyer beware. As it's sad because a lot of us living with long-term neurological conditions, there's no cure. We don't have anything else, so we're constantly looking for how do we improve our lives, how do we make our conditions better, right? How do we contribute to science? So that's always kind of a key thing. So getting back to the into how I joined the trial in Cleveland, eventually we passed all of those inclusion criteria and passed all the interviews, and they put together a surgery date. And at the time, we had to move to Cleveland. You had to live in Cleveland. So my boyfriend at the time, my now husband, we picked up and moved, and I was still working for the tech company, and they were extremely accommodating. So we set up a home office in Cleveland, so I was able to work remotely from them. And I joined the clinical trial and went through the implant process. That first surgery was 7.5 hours.
Wow.
So it's a pretty long surgery. But it's you wake up in the hospital, and the day that all the engineers come back in, and of course there's a physical therapist. I think there's one piece I left out is that you go into this surgical room, and there's surgeons, and there's engineers everywhere, and there's nurses and operating staff. But the key person in that room is the physical therapist, because as they're implanting these muscle electrodes, they turn it on in surgery, and the physical therapist is the one that says, yeah, that's the movement I want, or no, that is not the movement I want. And then they try to find it, do the right placement of that electrode. And then once they find that right movement, they suture it up. So they're very diligent on, even when they're doing the implanted process, they're just not guessing. They're actually stimulating and seeing where do I get that muscle movement and how do I get the best return.
And so what was the device and what was the aims of it as well?
Mm-hmm. So it's at the time it was an 8-channel system. In fact, I still have it today. It's the IRS 8. And it implanted into my quads, my hamstrings, glutes, and lower back on each side, so bilaterally. And so all of that is encompassed inside of the body. And then there's an external control box that has all the circuit boards and the battery power. And it communicates with the implant using RF power, or RF frequencies. And you send a signal through the external control, and it goes into the implants. The implant, which looks a lot like a pacemaker, decodes it, sends it to the electrodes, and the electrodes fire up and get the type of movement that you want. So that's how it basically works. But the outcomes that they're looking for, it's called the stand and transfer system. So they were looking to be able to stand using the system and be able to transfer in and out of your wheelchair. Which, people say, well, how come aren't you taught wheelchair skills and in rehab? And we are, but there are transfers that you're unable to do, particularly with my high level of injury. So with this system, you're now able to do those types of tasks. So that was the initial aim of what they were trying to achieve what they've found out over the years is that there's all these other functions that they can add onto it. And now they have a study that's just for trunk. So now, that's just on your trunk control. So you think you're sitting up pretty straight right now, right? So if you have none of those muscles, you can't do that, right? If you want to reach up and want to be able to use your arms bilaterally, if you don't have trunk control, you can't do that.
Because you have an imbalance, right? So you'd kind of fall over.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So this opens up the amount of people that can actually use this system, right? And that it allows for exercise so that you can build those muscles that you're constantly sitting on to help prevent pressure.
And so how are you sitting up? I mean, or how do people sit up otherwise? I mean, do they have to get strapped in? Or
usually they're strapped into their wheelchairs. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So when you think about that, that's the function that you get out of it. So I've been using that 8-channel system. I was initially implanted in November of 1999. And I used that system for, over 10 years. And with great success. It started to deteriorate. My standing started to deteriorate. And that's when I went back to the team. They had another implant that they had created, which was called the IST-16, which was a 16-channel system. And they had a new electrode. It's now a nerve electrode called a cuff. So it wraps around the nerve, and it has different channels on it. That was the first time I met Dr. Lee Fisher, who's now at the University of Pittsburgh. So he was actually working on his postdoc on that project with Dr. Ron Triolo. And so that was, hey, we can implant this additional system. We can put in these electrodes. We can help, augment what's kind of failing on your RSA, and we can give you some additional function as well. So that kind of revision, I call it Gen 2.0, took place in 2010. Yeah, so in 2010, now I have 2 implants. I have both of them on either side of my abdomen.
So is there training involved in this? I mean, and like lots of physical therapy, or how would you describe that process?
Yeah, so when I was first implanted, you wake up in the hospital and all these engineers come into your room, right? So
she's awake, come
yeah,
in.
they're awake, and they bring all this equipment, and they're like, okay, we're going to have it test out first, right? So here they put the coil over the implant, and they're testing the system and looking at the different thresholds. And the first time that they turn it on, like, you can see your leg kicking out, right? And there's nothing attached to it. You can see your muscle contract, and you're kicking out your leg. It's the coolest thing in the world, So if you've been paralyzed for a while and all of a sudden you see your muscle working, it's a really cool feeling. So that's, they do a lot of testing. They set the thresholds. And yeah, there was, when I was first implanted, they gave me exercise plans. I spent 3 months building up those muscles and exercising for 3 months. They brought me back, and then I was able to do my first stand. And do some therapy from there. So that was kind of the process to be able to get to the standing piece. Then you bring it home and you start to integrate it into your life. But being part of a clinical trial, you constantly come back because they constantly have lab projects and those types of things. So you volunteer a lot of your time to get into the lab to kind of help improve this system, and you become part of the research team. There's things that you see or that you use in the outside world, and you bring it back to the research team and say, hey, listen, can we correct this, or can we make this better, or this is what I'm seeing, etc. So really you become a part of the team and a part of helping to improve the device.
Honorary PhD.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that, but I can be an honorary pain in the ass too. So.
Were you causing problems for them, or what?
I wouldn't say I was causing problems, but I think it's a real active participant will constantly give feedback to them, and sometimes that feedback isn't always positive, right? So, but that's good. I mean, that's how we improve our devices and we make them better. And there's a lot of people that are involved in these clinical trials to advance our devices, particularly as we go into humans more and more. And they're the ones that are putting their bodies forward to make a difference, right? So we think of the exploration of flight, and we celebrate all those pilots that were able to do it, right? Or we think about going to the moon and what we do for astronauts, and we celebrate them. These are people that are in this implant world where we're really the ones on the front lines pioneers. We're putting our bodies forward for the advancement of science. It's no different from what an astronaut did, right?
Wow. And so with this second implant, how is that different and how is that similar?
Oh, so it's well, it's similar where I'm able to stand and get some of that main function.
I mean,
back.
I guess how's the technology progressed? Is there some improvements, or do you think that it'll last longer as well, or what?
Well, that's yet to be seen. We don't know, right?
We'll find out.
We'll
It's
find
only
out.
been 10 years, right?
You're right, right. So, so it's 2018, right? So, things have changed. So the electrodes. This is one of the things that we're trying to solve, and that was part of the cuff project. Is because the cuff wraps around the femoral nerve, and you have all these different electrodes. And one of the problems, the systemic problems with stimulating a muscle, is that we stimulate it and put it on as hard as it possibly can for a contraction. Well, fatigue will set in, just like any human, right? And if we over fatigue, we can do damage to the muscle tissue. So how do we overcome that fatigue? How do we, change some of the stimulation patterns to be able to give some of the muscle tissue a rest, but still be able to get that function? And that was part of the research project for the cuff electrode. And really, how do we design these stimulation patterns so that we can get more use out of it? So typically when someone stands, the first muscle that wears out is your quads. So by wrapping it around the femoral nerve, we're looking at all those 4 muscles that are in your quad. Actually, technically the 3 muscles, because one of them actually makes a hip flexion. So really, how do we do those patterns to be able to give a little bit of extra time for people? So I think that's still an unanswered question, and it's still kind of ongoing research as we're trying to figure that out. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow, that's really cool. Well, yeah, I mean, I think maybe we can have this first part be, about this, and then we can talk about the neurotech reports and the future and everything like this.